Alright, here we are with the class overview videos. Today we're starting off with the Barbarian. Now, Barbarians, the word itself has different connotations in different uses. For example, the actual dictionary definition of a barbarian is anyone that is a member of a tribe or a community that was not one of the great civilizations of the past, be it the Greek civilization, the Roman civilization, or the Christian civilization. For example, during a lot of movies that take place back in ancient times, especially during the Roman era, people as far into the north as Germany and England were considered barbarians prior to their being conquered by the Roman Empire. Crazy things, huh? Another thing is that barbarians are also considered to be uncultured, crude, brutish, things, very, very uncivilized. Barbarians are generally people from nomadic tribes or from people with a very shamanistic upbringing, and usually some of the more monstrous creature races. For example, orcs and goblins typically have barbarians rise from their ranks, and a lot of the nomadic people of the north, of the frozen wastes and distant outlands, the very edges of civilization, so to speak, typically have barbarians, are typically where the barbarians come from. They are very rooted in family and community, and honor plays a great role in most of their decision makings. Now, what aspects do the barbarian have? Well, for most of the game information, I'm going to be using the 3.5 edition of Dungeons & Dragons for specific points. So, what are barbarians as far as the game goes? Well, they are a frontline combat specialist. They are proficient with all simple and martial weapons, they're proficient with light and medium armors, and they're proficient with most shields. They also have an exceedingly high strength score if they are built properly. They have a high constitution score, and generally speaking, your third highest stat for a barbarian should be your dexterity score, because that ties into your armor class. What else does a barbarian have that makes them extremely good at the front line? Well, they typically start off with the highest hit point die in the entire game, the D12. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with these terms, here's a quick rundown. When I refer to dice, or when the book refers to dice, or when any piece of information on gaming refers to a die, they're going to have it in a simple mechanics. There's going to be a number indicating the number of dice used, and then a D followed by a number which indicates the number of sides the die has. Polyhedral dice for gaming in games such as Dungeons & Dragons have several different iterations. There's the D4, which is a die with four sides. There's the D6, which is the standard die everyone's familiar with. The D8, the D10, the D12, and the D20. The D12, which forms the barbarian's hit points total, is the second largest die in the game, and the largest hit point die in the game. That right there is a D12. And barbarians start off the game with all 12 hit points, plus their constitution modifier starting off in 3rd edition. So, for most players, that means they have a very, very respectable hit point total at first level. Add that to the fact that they have strength as their primary stat and dexterity following close behind. Not very many barbarians have to worry about falling down. So what makes a barbarian different from other combat-oriented classes? Well, they have a number of really cool class features, but nothing sets them apart any more than the rage mechanic. Now, the rage mechanics is an ability that all barbarians get, where they can go into a berserk mode, where their strength increases, their hit points increase, and they can no longer be dominated as easily. They can still be dominated if they fail their will save, but the will save gets extra bonuses. Now, the downside to this is, while you are stronger and you are more durable, you're not concerned with defending yourself. So you lose part of your armor class, primarily from your dex. Also, anything that requires you to think logically or be patient, you can't really do that. I mean, you can still attempt to, but if you want to do something that's intelligence-based, you pretty much either have to end the rage or take a hefty penalty. And if you have magic items that require a spell word component or spell trigger to activate them, it's probably not going to happen. So why would you want to fly into a rage if all these penalties apply? Well, take for instance Conan the Barbarian. Now, of course, there are two different interpretations now. There's the Arnold Schwarzenegger version, and now the newer one, which stays a little bit more true to my mind of the graphic novel. And in all honesty, Arnold's version of Conan, he wasn't really, the only thing that made him a barbarian was he came from a quasi-nomadic tribe that wasn't part of the great civilization of the land. Samaria was kind of less progressed as it was described in those movies. So it was more rural, more rustic, and that's really the only thing that applies to make him a barbarian. As far as his actual acting and whatnot in that movie, he was actively a thief, and he was more primarily a fighter who came up in the gladiatorial rings. Now, the new version stays a little bit more true to the graphic novel, but he's still not a barbarian as far as D&D sense goes, because he is trained as a fighter. You know, he's very intelligent and has a lot of things, and you never really see him fly into a rage. But getting back to the point, let's say that you're in this sudden heated battle and you're on the verge of being overrun. Well, going into a rage, you gain extra hit points and you can hit harder. So let's say you're low on hit points, you go into a rage, you gain extra hit points. Now, those hit points disappear when you end the rage, and you have to be careful about that, because if you drop below your standard hit points and then end the rage, you drop down to a certain number of hit points and then your rage ends, either through the natural duration or you choose to voluntarily end it, and your hit point total decreases back to what it would normally be, and it's less than it's 0 or below, you fall unconscious. 0 in most game systems, you're immobile or unconscious, and negative hit points, you're slowly slipping into death. And that's a completely another topic we'll cover in another video on actual game mechanics just by themselves, because it's different in every edition of the game. Now, in the rage, your strength increases. Why is this important? Well, strength ties into how much damage you can deal. When you swing your weapon, you roll your attack die, and you add your attack bonus, which is also adding into your strength bonus if you're using a melee weapon. Most weapons have a damage modifier, which is indicated by X number of dice of X number of sides. For example, a longsword is a D8, which means you roll 1d8, and whatever it comes up with is how much damage you've done with the sword. You also, in rolling attack damage, add your strength modifier for melee weapons. For most melee weapons, unless you're using a light weapon, which I'll talk about more when I get into bards, because typically bards do better, in my opinion, with light weapons, because they can take the weapon finesse feat, which means they use their dex instead of their strength when they determine their damage. Barbarians in rage get anywhere from 4 to 8 extra points of damage just for being in a rage. You have your standard, let's say your strength modifier is a +2. And you enter into a rage at first level. And according to this, when you enter a rage, you would gain a temporary +4 bonus to your strength score. So you've automatically gone from dealing your weapon damage +2 to your weapon damage +6. Just for entering into a rage. So there's benefit there. Let's say that you've raged earlier and somebody comes up and hits you and rolls really, really well. Maybe not a critical hit, but a really sound hit. Well, you're in a rage, your hit points have increased. So now you can take more damage. And for a lot of players that play Barbarians, the rage is something that should be spared as far as use, because first level you get it once a day, and you don't get another use of it until you hit 4th level where you can use it twice a day. So it's really something that you have to be careful about. You have to ration out your rage. And you get to rage for a certain number of rounds, so you have to be careful when you rage, you have to be careful for how long you rage, and once you end your rage, you really can't restart the rage because you only get it once a day for the first 3 levels. Now, at 4th level, you can end your rage and then restart it again later because you get 2 uses of your rage that day. So why is this mechanic so offsetting from other classes? Well, other classes, especially combat-oriented classes like the fighter and the cleric and monks, paladins, things of that nature, they typically come from schools of thought. They come from places that train you how to analyze the battlefield, how to maneuver your enemy to your advantage, how to analyze their weaknesses and their strengths, how to tailor the entire fight. Barbarians don't come from schools of combat. They come from, frozen tundras. They come from grassy plains. They come from places where fighting styles come from their ancestors. Their father teaches them the same way that their father taught them, or their mother taught them, and so on and so forth. Tribes have their own method of fighting. They have preferred weapons. They have preferred fighting styles, and the rage mechanic just adds into that by giving them the ability to enter into a berserk mode, which allows them to deal more damage, which, frankly, when I DM a game and I see a barbarian enter to a rage, I will actually take rolls to see if my NPC enemies are being demoralized by the sudden fact that this person is just now mowing a swath through them. That, he's shrugging, he can take an arrow wound and he shrugs it off like it was a fly biting him. And for players playing a barbarian, that roleplay, it's really, really ties into everything they do. If they give, when they enter their rage, don't just say, I enter a rage. Because that's really boring. And unless that's the game style that your group does, it really doesn't enter into the role-playing aspect. I mean, when you enter a rage, holler a war cry. Whether you actually scream the war cry at the table or not is your choice entirely. But, have your character actually seem like he enters into an unthinking blood rage, just screams a blood cry and rushes into combat, taking hits and ignoring them as though they're nothing. That is the hallmark of the barbarian as far as gameplay elements go. They can use any weapon they can use practically any weapon and wear practically any armor. So it's not like, even if their weapon breaks, it's not like they can't snatch something up from the ground and use it until the battle is over. So what else makes a barbarian different? We've got their combat prowess, you got the rage. They also get an ability called fast movement in 3rd edition, and what this means that they move faster than a standard member of their race. And In 3rd edition, it means they get an extra 10 feet per round. So an average human barbarian would be able to move 40 feet in a round as opposed to 30 feet, as long as they're not overly encumbered. Now, I don't deal with encumbrance in my games. It's a lot of number crunching that really, really is hard to keep track of, and in the heat of combat, you really can't remember all the modifiers to your encumbrance at one time. So I really don't deal with it. A lot of other players that I played with and had DM involvement with don't pay attention to encumbrance. I have played with some that do, and while it's more realistic, I don't really play D&D to be ultra realistic. I'm playing it to get away from my worries and immerse myself in a great fantasy world where anything can happen. So what else do barbarians get? Well, they also get an ability called Uncanny Dodge. Now, what Uncanny Dodge is they can no longer be flanked, and they retain their dexterity bonus even if caught flat-footed. Now, for a quick rundown on that, being caught flat-footed means you've been surprised and you don't have your dexterity bonus to your armor class because you were caught by surprise, you're not reacting as fast. With Uncanny Dodge, you retain that even if you're caught flat-footed, which gives you a bonus to your reflex save to get out of the way, to avoid a hit, to shove somebody out of the way, things of that nature. And that actually does increase later on in the game. They also get Trap Sense, which again rogues get, where you get a bonus to sensing traps because you're so aware, you're naturally aware of your surroundings, and you might subconsciously pick up on something that's not quite right with the area that you're in. So even if you have a rogue, it's always good to have a barbarian in your group just for that extra ability to see if there's a trap ahead. Now, some abilities that barbarians primarily get and some other classes get at higher levels is an ability called damage reduction. Now, damage reduction is an ability where they can shrug off a certain number of points off the attack. So let's say they get hit and they have damage reduction. Depending on what their DR stat is, they can shrug off anywhere from 1 to 5 points of damage, depending on what level they are. Now, what that means is if they start off when they get damage reduction, they get DR1 when they gain the ability. That means, unless it's a magic attack, they ignore 1 point of damage off of all attacks. And you'll see that a lot in monster blocks for those of you who are thinking about DMing. Werewolves have damage reduction, vampires have damage reduction, some larger creatures have damage reduction over certain types of weapons. And it's always going to be listed what the damage reduction is as far as how many points it ignores and what it's vulnerable to. Like a werewolf, damage reduction stat might be DR5/silver, which means it ignores 5 points of damage for every attack unless it's hit with a silver weapon. And vampires will have something similar to that versus magic. And I'll get more into that when I get to the DM sessions. But that's a really interesting ability to have because that means not only when you enter, now you can enter a rage and have all this extra strength and extra durability, but now you get to ignore certain numbers of damage points. You can, let's say you're a 19th level barbarian, you enter your rage, you gain so much more hit points, you gain so much more powerful attacks, and you get to ignore the first 5 points of damage from any non-magical weapon that hits you. And you're the D&D equivalent of a Sherman tank at that point. Barbarians are just amazing classes, and anyone who really wants to just feel that surge in a game, I highly recommend playing a barbarian. Now, what are some ways to roleplay a barbarian? Well, Barbarians, like I said earlier, tend to act very honorable. They have, they've got their family history to uphold. They've got their tribe's honor to uphold. And generally, the only reason they go off adventuring is to benefit their tribe or their village or their clan. So, when you make your concept for your barbarian, come up with a reason why he left his clan, why he's leaving this tight-knit community of individuals with shared beliefs. Was a member of the clan murdered and he's off to find the murderer? Is the tribe in danger of being overrun by competing clans or some other threat, and he's gone off to adventure to learn more effective combat techniques so he can better defend his family? What else would cause a man to leave his clan? Is he going to find a cure for a sickness? Was he cast out, exiled? If he was exiled, what was the thing that caused him to be exiled? These are all very, very interesting things to come up with to explain why the barbarian's out adventuring. And then you can tie that into his characterizations. For example, let's continue with the exile. If he was exiled, will he immediately react angrily to somebody who insults his honor or indicates that he might be a coward? Does he view himself with shame? Does he carry himself with a slightly ashamed air? Or does he believe himself to be wrongfully exiled and he seeks to find the evidence to prove his worth and re-enter his tribe? Or was his clan brutally murdered, like in Conan, and he was taken a slave, and now he's off trying to basically gain vengeance for his slain family? It's so open for characterization as a barbarian because, number one, you don't have a set background. You could be a nomad. You could be from small villages. You could be from another continent. Small islands that have very limited contact with the mainland. Any of these things can set up a great situation for a barbarian class. So, how do you build a barbarian? Well, typically, you want to start off with a high strength stat, a high constitution stat, and generally speaking, you want to fill in dexterity as your third stat because that, again, plays into your armor. Now, there are some restrictions on barbarians as far as alignment goes in 3rd edition. Barbarians could be any alignment as long as it was not lawful. You could be chaotic, you could be neutral, good or evil, but you could not be lawful good or lawful evil or lawful neutral. It's just, they very much follow the rules of nature. Nature's got laws, but they're not really cut in stone laws. It's more like the law of the wild, where the strongest survive and the weak perish. Now, why is that important? Well, there are game mechanics that can cause your alignment to shift. And there are also some DMs that will alter your alignment based on how you roleplay your character if you roleplay. For example, if you're roleplaying a barbarian, but you're following every law set in front of you, and you very much are you follow the law. Town law, city law, national law. You're a lawful character. You're not chaotic. And that is kind of that's a very narrow definition of how the alignment systems work. But basically, there are DMs that will force you to shift your alignment or talk with you about shifting your alignment depending on how you act. And I actually keep track of my players' alignments because I have some players that say they're this and they act completely different. And I just, after 2 or 3 game sessions, I'm just, you're really not acting the alignment you're stating. You're acting this. Now, we either need to adjust your role-playing ability, or we need to adjust your alignment. And that's really dangerous for some classes. Because some classes, if your alignment shifts into an alignment that you're not supposed to be or can't be, you lose some class abilities. For example, barbarians that become lawful, they lose their rage ability, and they lose the ability to gain any more levels as a barbarian. So that's a really important thing to think about. It used to be paladins had to be lawful good. If they weren't lawful good, they lost a lot of their paladin abilities, and they couldn't gain any more levels as a paladin unless they sought out atonement, which I'll get to when I get to paladins. Barbarians, if you become lawful, that's it. You're no longer a barbarian. You keep all of your combat abilities except for rage, and you can't advance as a barbarian anymore. So it's a good idea to keep track of your alignment and try to keep your character playing in the vein of that alignment. So when you roll your dice, sit up and make sure that strength is high, because you're primarily going to be out there on the front line going back and forth with whatever enemies your DM has set up for you. So you want to be able to tear them down as fast as possible. Generally speaking, barbarians usually choose two-handed weapons because of the higher damage base. They choose heavy weapons, broadswords, great swords, double axes, or double-bitted battle axes, warhammers, things of that nature. Things that you use two-handed for that extra half or double strength score to damage. They tend to wear armors that are good at defending them but don't hamper their movement, because barbarians, you don't want to lose that fast movement. You want to be able to traverse the battlefield as quickly as possible. So, you don't want to over-encumber yourself by wearing plate mail. That's not really what barbarians are seen as. If they have mail, it's generally ring mail or chain mail. They don't favor tactics over straight out confrontations. Now, that is a generalization again. That's how I view barbarians. They are always the impulsive ones, the ones that charge into battle first. I have played with some people who played barbarians who were natural tacticians. They were able to look at the field and immediately sense were best to attack. They weren't quite as good at it as the fighter in the group who actually made sure his background included tactics training. But for somebody who just he played him as an innate tactician, he could see the battlefield and go out and go where he could do the most good. Barbarians, you can have them be quick to anger, or you can have them be very stoic. You can have them any way, shape, or form possible. And generally speaking, when you build them, you want to keep your strength high, you want to keep your dex high, you want to keep your constitution high. Every time you get a modifier bonus, look at the 3 most important stats and shore up the one that you feel is in the most need of shoring up. So how would I build a barbarian? Well, I roll my stats out, and I'd make sure I put the highest score in strength, because I'm going to be out there trading blows with most of the enemies. I want to be able to tear them down fast, because even with my insane hit points, I can't take infinite damage. So I want to be able to end my fights quickly. Constitution would be next, because I want to have as many hit points as I can to add on to that D12 that you get. And then I want to have a decent dexterity. I don't want to max out my dex, because after a certain point, some armors actually cap you on your dex. So at that point in time, your dexterity actually can only rise so high. You still get your full dex modifier for things like reflex saves and initiative. But for armor, which is your main thing keeping you alive, I don't want to raise my dex above a +3 modifier if I only get to use 2 of those. And heavier armors do incur a higher dex penalty. What would I do as a concept? I'm not entirely sure. I would, it would depend on what I'm thinking of come game time. And it also would depend on the setting, the campaign setting, what kind of world is this? Where are the barbarians from? Are they mostly tundra? Are they mostly grasslands? Are they mostly desert dwellers? Are they nomads? Are they settled in small villages? I need to know this information before I can build a concept that would actually fit into the world. Unless I want to be just an exiled member of a clan. So, to recap, barbarians are Sherman tanks of D&D. They have the highest hit die in the world, as far as the setting goes, D12. They get the Rage ability, which increases their strength, increases their hit points. They get an Uncanny Dodge and Trap Sense, and they get damage reduction. So, essentially, to sum it up in one word, barbarians are tanks. They are your meat shield that goes out in the front of the ground. Generally speaking, you want either a barbarian or a fighter in your group to be the meat shield, to be the tank, to be the bulwark, to spearhead the charge. So, next time you sit down at the game, and you're not sure what you want to play, see what other players are playing. If you notice that you're kind of low on melee combatants, consider rolling a barbarian. Join us next week when we get into the bar.